Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the meeting of the Licensing Committee. My name is Councillor Paul Wray, and I will be chairing today's meeting. Could I remind everyone that today's meeting is being live streamed onto the City Council website so that the public can observe the meeting without the need to be present. And to those who are watching either live or the recording, welcome to viewing this meeting. Can I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves and mute their microphone once they've done? And what I will do is I will go in this direction around the table. So starting with Rob, and then we'll go in that direction and back.
Oh, good morning. My name is Robert Brown. I'm the legal advisor to the chair today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Councillor Lennox from Crossgates and Winmore.
Morning, I'm Councillor John Illingworth from Kirkstall Ward.
Good morning, I'm Councillor Lisa Martin from Roundhay Ward.
Good morning, I'm Graham Berwick. I'm the Service Development Officer for taxi and private hire licensing.
Good morning, Councillor Paul Alderson from Guiseley and Rawdon.
Morning, everybody. Andrew White, Taxi and Private Hire Licensing Manager.
Good morning, everybody. Councillor Linda Richards from Wetherby.
Morning, Councillor Hutchison. Morning, off.
Good morning, Councillor Neil Buckley, Old Woodley Ward.
Morning, Billy Flynn, Councillor for Adler Wharfdale Ward.
That's a donation to the Lord Mayor's charity.
Good morning, John Grieve, Governance Services. I do apologise, Chair.
And just Councillor Gibson, because she just came in just at the end of that.
Good morning, Councillor Gibson, Crossgates and Winmore Ward.
Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. Moving to item agenda 1.
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there were no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press or public. Item 3, late items. I am unaware of any late items of business. Agenda item 4, could I ask members to declare any interests they may have? I'll assume that's none. Under agenda item 5, apologies for absence. Councillor Alice Smart, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. So item agenda number 6, minutes of the previous meeting held on the 2nd of November 2021. Do members accept these minutes as a true and correct record? I'll assume they're correct unless indicated otherwise. I will assume it's correct then. Item agenda number 6, matters arising from the minutes. Are there any matters arising from the minutes? If anyone would like to comment, if there are no comments, I assume that we're all happy with that. We're all happy with that. That's great. Item agenda number 8, taxing private hire, a single licensing policy. Could I invite Andrew White from Taxi and Private Hire Licensing to present this report?
Thank you, Chair. Graham Berwick in Taxi and Private Hire Licensing has written a large element of the single licensing policy, and Graham and I have written the report together. I'm hoping that the report on the policy are fairly explanatory, and it might well be, if you want a lot more information, we'll probably have to provide written responses. So I'm going to talk you through the report and then indicate maybe the key areas you might want to discuss in terms of the provisions in the policy. So the council, in its role as the licensing authority for the Hackney private hire trade, has got an overwhelming responsibility to ensure the safety of the public. The report today presents the licensing committee a collated, condensed, simplified taxi and private hire licensing policy document for approval. The council has not, up to now, unless it is in the distant past, had provided a single taxi and private hire licensing policy document. The requirement to produce that has actually stemmed from the Department for Transport statutory taxi and private hire standards published last year and also developed under consultation for the previous few years. So the council has previously endorsed many individual policies introduced over decades. I think the list of supporting documents below this policy is over 22 documents and over 200 separate pages, which we haven't produced in the pack for today, but we can certainly develop and share with you, and you can see where the documents are. We wanted to focus today on a single taxi and private hire licensing policy for the council. It's really important for members to note that even though this is dated December 2021, this policy introduces no new policy or regulatory content, even though there might be things actually as a city we would want to discuss and want to consult on. The report indicates a sort of an outline for a policy review timetable, and we would then update the relevant sections of this single policy together with the more detailed conditions documents further down. But that would only be after the usual consultation mechanisms and member approval. Okay. So the recommendations are twofold, really. One is we're asking you to endorse the proposed policy, single document that summarizes the existing policies. It might be unusual for you to see sort of it all in one place rather than in separate documents. We'll make sure that you can have and access the full and previously agreed text, but it is in 20 separate documents. And then secondly, there's a miswording there on the recommendations, with just an additional recommendation to get your input or approval of an indicative review timetable. And that's come from the first 3 trade meetings that the chair has chaired with the local taxi and private hire trade. Normally we would have some sort of engagement as well with stakeholder groups, as well as we've mentioned before, but I think having a timetable, as long as licensing committee members approve, I think gives us a good way forward in terms of timing reviews and consultations. So moving on, so onto page 10. So the impact this proposal will have, the aim is for this policy not to have any negative impact in terms of raising new concerns. It produces no policy items. It does not make any changes to existing policies. It simply collates existing licensing policies into one document. That is not the same in neighbouring authorities. Other neighbouring authorities have used the opportunity to update or refresh certain areas of their single licensing policy if they already had one, or particularly in line with other methods. So at least 2 of the neighbouring authorities are also going to do a taxi and private hire licensing fees review. I think that is COVID driven rather than policy driven. So it's not the same in every authority. I think in terms of the positive outcomes, it provides some confidence that there is maybe one main document that people can refer to explain why the council does what it does. In terms of section 3, the consultation and engagement, the national consultation on the statutory taxi and private hire standards was completed in 2019. That's with the Department of Transport and the council appointed trade members and stakeholders to that consultation. The contents of the single policy have each undergone the relevant consultations when each of the separate policies were discussed, which is why we don't think we need to consult again on something that simply reiterates what we've done separately. For minor changes or updates, we don't expect the council would need to consult, but would make the necessary administrative or operational decisions. And that might just involve a minor clarification of wording. For any significant changes, the council will need to engage and consult with a wide range of trade stakeholders and maybe other licensing authorities as well. I think particularly in terms of the discussion around regional issues, or particularly the areas that our licensing approach maybe can't touch in terms of things like out of town or cross border, there it would be definitely relevant to strengthen communication with other core cities who may be in a similar position to Leeds, i.e. at the centre of the city region, as well as neighbouring authorities. Resource implications, we've said there's none at the moment. In terms of that, we've developed this clearly. When the policies are changed or updated, there may well be resource implications. Okay, legal implications. The statutory vehicle standards don't alter any key UK legislation, nor do they make any new legislation. However, it's the strongest possible guidance central government can issue. So the key phrase we've got to use is we've got to have regard to those standards. And particularly, we've taken the opportunity to write the draft policy, subject to approval, following exactly the same format, using exactly the same framework, using the same chapter headings as the national guidance, just to show our support for the national guidance, but also so that it's easy for people to compare the policies between authorities, especially if other authorities have also used the same national framework. The supporting conditions, 20 plus documents such as for drivers, vehicles, operators, and so on, remain in place and at the moment are unaltered, and they would only be altered when we went through engagement, consultation, working groups, and so on, depending on how we as an authority wanted to progress. Okay. Key risks. The main risk we've got is really about protecting the public. The importance of ensuring that the licensing regime protects vulnerable people cannot be overestimated. And I think particularly it's very refreshing to see it in statutory guidance, particularly, and it was there again in the suitability, the national support for the national suitability approach as well. I wasn't going to go into great detail in terms of the proposal supporting the council's 3 pillars. I think what I'd emphasize is, yes, we've got to focus on keeping people safe. We've also got to focus in providing high quality public services, getting services right first time and improving customer satisfaction. It's absolutely a challenge during lockdown, but also a broader contribution to priorities such as reducing crime levels and their impact across Leeds, tackling antisocial behaviour, and reducing vehicle emissions in addition to the safeguarding priority we've already mentioned. Okay. And then sort of options, timescales and measuring success. And then I'll talk you through the report, and then we'll come back to the timetable for implementation. So I'll talk you through the policy, and then we'll go to the timetable for implementation. I think it's fair to say the council did consider consulting on some possible changes from existing policies and conditions, which is a step other authorities have taken. However, owing to representation received about the council's previous consultations, I think we've suggested that only one consultation at a time, very careful consultation, maybe taking extra steps to make sure that consultation takes place. And therefore we decided to issue the policy clarifying the current policies and conditions and propose an indicative timetable rather than start another consultation on this that might then blur the lines about what our priorities should be going forward. Okay, in terms of success measures, and then I'll take you to the outline of the policy. So we're hoping that licence holders will get a better understanding of legislation and policy, which may reduce the number of complaints or requests for clarification and appeals. I very much hope that licensing committee members and councillors will have one definitive policy document covering broad licensing themes, which should better aid understanding of taxi and private hire licensing, rather than what might be seen as sort of narrow, multiple separate conditions documents. And then thirdly, we expect that our stakeholders will have one definitive policy document covering the broad licensing themes, which should better aid understanding of taxi and private hire licensing rather than multiple separate documents as well. So hopefully this is a measure that should improve understanding. I think we will get some feedback back from people saying, why doesn't it include such and such? And we'll have to make sure that we address that then in our timetable going forward. Before I go on to the timetable of implementation, is it worth us just walking through the draft policy itself so you can see what it includes? And I think particularly then we'll come back to the timetable. It might be helpful in terms of just asking for questions, and then we'll come back to the question around implementation and further reviews secondly.
If you briefly want to kind of step through it, I'm hoping colleagues are relatively able to understand the basic format as it is, but if you want to quickly go through just for the benefit of the public potentially watching later, and then we'll come on to the substantive part, which will be the indicative reviews. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's helpful to start really with the outline of the policies. The outline of the policy on page 18 of your packs. So this is all a chapter heading really, and this just outlines, and again this deliberately mirrors the national standards from the Department of Transport. So we're using exactly the same chapter headings: administering the licensing regime, gathering and sharing information, decision making, driver licensing, vehicle licensing, operator licensing, compliance and enforcement, fees, and then at the back we've provided definitions and then a list of appendices. And the appendices are very broadly
each of the separate conditions documents. We've got 7 separate conditions documents, I think, for vehicles. We've got multiple conditions documents, for example, on things like DBS checks. It's not just drivers that need a DBS check, other people need a DBS check as well. So particularly that, I think you can see from the table of contents, we've provided in about 3 or 4 pages for each section, a summary of each of the key levers we've got in terms of taxi and private hire licensing. So why we administer the licensing regime, who we share information with, who we gather it from, how we make decisions, and then into the specifics around issuing initial licenses and then renewing licenses for drivers, vehicles, operators. I think arguably for the first time, Chapter 8 talks about compliance and enforcement, which is a summary of what we provided in lots and lots of separate documents, but for there in one place, we've got 3 or 4 pages just on compliance and enforcement. So really just to give you some confidence that what Graham and the team have done is to coordinate probably over 200 pages in separate documents and summarize it into about 40 pages here, including a list of definitions, so on. So it's a significant piece of work. Probably taken some time from taxi and private licensing to reduce it down. We probably want to mirror every single condition in every detail. We think we've covered exactly the main points in every section. The main reason is why we do what we do. It doesn't cover in every detail, every eventuality of what we might, what action we might take. So if I just pause it there in terms of the overall framework for the policy, with you that we parked the issue of the implementation timetable just to see if there's any questions that you've got from what you've read, or suggestions.
Thank you for that, Andrew. And just before I bring in Cllr Garthwaite, I think just to kind of clarify to colleagues, this is bringing in no new policies. It's not changing anything. It's a bit of a tidy up exercise. And in terms in accessibility, we've already tasked taxi and private hire licensing to go to the council's communications team to make sure it meets the Clear English guidelines. There's obviously reference to other languages and interpretation at the back. And obviously, as Andrew has clearly said, this is not the definitive set of policies. This is to make a very quick, easy introduction so that people can find those more definitive policies, particularly as we start to go through the journey of reviewing them in the next kind of part of this discussion. So just for clarity, for the clarity of the trade and the public maybe watching at home, this is introducing no new policies. It's really a tidying up exercise in line with the statutory guidance from the Department of Transport. Cllr Garthwaite.
Oh, good. It's working. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this. I certainly welcome the fact that all those policies have been put into one document. I think this is a very good thing. And I also welcome your clarification that it is going to go to the comms team for looking at the plain English, which in some cases is not there. And there are quite a lot of small grammatical mistakes which do need to be cleared up. And it would be very tedious indeed for me to go through that, like the English teacher that I've been in front of everyone now. But for instance, the word advice rather than advise, and it does make a difference. It makes a difference to the sense. It makes it slightly harder to read in some cases. On our page 23, the policy page 7, there's A, B, C, D, E bullet points. There should only be 3 things, small things like that, but it is peppered through. And this does need to be sorted. Now, I do have a couple of questions for wider clarification, if I may. I'll do them one at a time. Let me just find the page. On our page 29, the policy page 13, it says, Leeds City Council has amended its constitution to give reciprocal enforcement powers to authorised enforcement areas of the following authorities. And then there's a list of the authorities. Now, does that mean that someone who's licensed in Leeds could be brought up before, say, Wakefield to be for a complaint? Or what exactly does this mean?
Can I just ask you to get all your questions out in one go, and then we'll do it all in one go, if that's okay?
Okay, that was my first question then. Then on page 37, Our page 37, paragraph 6.3, the final paragraph. It says, additionally, some vehicles' designs are not appropriate for people who may suffer from a wide range of spinal, visual, ambulance or mobility disabilities. Well, this is clear, but where does that actually get us? Does it mean that certain vehicles for designs would never be allowed? Does it mean they might be allowed in some cases? Because some people might only be able to use one particular one, i.e. wheelchair accessible vehicles. Does that mean they all have to be wheelchair accessible? I don't think it does, but it doesn't seem very clear to me. Maybe it does to others. Then at the top, paragraph 6.5 on our page 38, it says, with over 51% of Hackney carriage vehicles wheelchair accessible. It seems to me that that is going to change, and it could change next month. So I suggest that that particular phrase might go, unless you can tell me a particular reason why it should stay, because it could become 55% or it could become 49%. Things change. And that here finally, in the chart, vehicle age criteria, with the ultra low emission vehicles, this is on our page 39, it says inspection at 7 or 8 years. Well, why 7 or 8? I mean, surely it should be one or the other, unless there's a reason why this is a movable feast. And it says also in the additional notes, the bullet point ones at the bottom right, all vehicles must also be, there's a list, it's not totally grammatical. And then the last point says service history. All vehicles must always be service history. Now, I'm assuming this means have their service history available at all times or something like that, but it's just not totally clear. I realize the difficulties in putting all this together from 200, all these enormous numbers of policies and so on. So it's just, I do need to be clear about those points. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to come in, but just quickly, I think in terms of the inspection at 7 or 8, that's probably a policy matter that's being copied across rather than the grammatical error. So that one will come under the, when we discuss potential policy reviews. But if you want to go on the other points, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Chair. So in order, yes, they are distracting. I will need to sit down with Graham to work out if Graham has honestly transcribed across poorly written content from earlier, or it's new poorly written content from us in terms of that. I very strongly suspect the 7 or 8 years is because of some ambiguity about when a policy was implemented and how it applies. So I think Graham particularly has had to ride two horses between accurately reflecting what's already there, even if we prefer it said something different. We will go through, Graham, we will go through the typos to make sure that there aren't in some cases they're distracting, in some cases they might be confusing. In terms of reciprocal powers, that's page 13. So without, I just need to tweak this back so that I've got it. So page 13. If we didn't have reciprocal powers in place, the powers that our licensing officers would have, our enforcement officers would have on street would be minimal in terms of any vehicle that is not licensed in Leeds. And obviously in terms of Leeds, it's the largest, busiest nighttime economy. We've got 2 or 3 of the largest universities in West Yorkshire. We have thousands of journeys made from outside Leeds into Leeds every year. Let me go to the reciprocal arrangements. So the reciprocal arrangements don't give enforcement officers full powers. So Leeds officers don't have full enforcement powers over Bradford vehicles or the other vehicles listed there. What it does do, it gives them the authority to inspect the vehicle, talk to the driver, provide what we would call a compliance check on street, and warn or give the driver a ticket if there is something that is dangerous or a concern. And that might be something as straightforward as a brake light out or something like that, or a tire in dangerous condition. I would have to check and double check, but if an enforcement officer saw a driver who was not wearing a badge, in Leeds, they need to wear a badge and they could be suspended if they don't wear a badge. We would need to double check with that authority if that driver should have been wearing a badge. And that's a degree of checking downstream. I mentioned mobile working earlier in terms that'd be very good to be able to check on street and say, we've got a driver here, is licensed in your authority, not wearing a badge. What powers do we have? So without those reciprocal powers, our enforcement officers have minimal authority on street against vehicles not licensed in Leeds. With the reciprocal powers they have, they're sort of halfway towards that. We would very strongly encourage every licensing authority, their officers, to have national powers. So irrespective of where that vehicle is licensed, those officers are actually authorized to take steps to check that that vehicle is safe. That doesn't mean those vehicles need to meet Leeds conditions. So we've spoken about things like tinted windows. They wouldn't have the power to say, Leeds policy is windows can't be tinted above a certain level. You can't drive in Leeds. I'm, suspending your vehicle. So we've got sort of halfway powers in terms of reciprocal powers. Types of vehicle, it's a really challenging one. So this is page 37, if I've understood that right. So types of vehicle, I think some of the slightly clunky wording is inherited from the vehicle policy and we've retained it word for word. In terms of accessibility, and I get this a lot of the time around that, we get people wanting to license vehicles that I think in some cases the drop from the back seat down to the pavement is more than 4 inches or 6 inches in terms of, you think about the high up sort of SUV Land Rover style or something like. We wouldn't license a Land Rover as a private hire vehicle. But also conversely, we get the sort of low slung sporty models with very hard suspension. They're not suitable either in terms of that. So what we're trying to say is we want a range of vehicles. They all need to be safe and suitable. If the policy didn't say this, it might say it in more detail somewhere else, as we discuss with the council's access committee, and we get a profile of people getting into and out of vehicles. We've got a current issue at the moment about vehicles where the middle seat in the back is not really wide enough. It's supposed to be 16 inches and it isn't. In terms of, it's also high up, so it blocks the view of the driver through the rear mirror. So it's difficult to phrase that in that way, but we need every vehicle to, like, so for example, we've got safe and suitable for people. We want to say safe, comfortable and suitable for vehicles. So that's the reason. So yes, I'm afraid it's inherited from the previous more detailed vehicle policy. In terms of over the next page, 51%, that's one of the areas where the council has got a very strong provision. So it would only be if the owners of those hackney carriage vehicles said, I no longer want to work as a hackney carriage vehicle proprietor. They are required in our policy, if they replace a hackney carriage wheelchair accessible vehicle, they're required to replace it with another one. So the number would be around half of 500 plus vehicles, which has tended to be almost always about 50% or 51%, but we could say around half, and that would certainly be future proof. But that's one of the areas where the numbers don't change a great deal from year to year. And then 7 or 8 years, I'm very sure, but we'll double check, Graham, that provision was in that policy when that policy was first written. And I agree it needs tidying up. What we're very clear about is it's either 7 years from when it was first manufactured or when it was first registered in the UK. It's not 7 years from when it was first licensed as a vehicle. And sometimes there's a discrepancy between when a vehicle was first licensed, particularly for imported vehicles and things like that. I think that's the reason for the broader wording, unless you've got anything else to add, Graham.
No, I quite agree. Thank you very much indeed for your comments. I really would be grateful if I could see the red ink on the page. That would be really beneficial. Yes, please. The number of times we've read through this have been quite remarkable. It has been an extremely difficult document to put together, as you can appreciate. Well, you have appreciated. Thanks very much. In the text with regard to the vehicles, it does say here beyond 7 or 8 years of age, as well as the chart, but I will check on that. And we have carefully transposed from some quite old documents the conditions and bylaws and such like into something that hopefully is easier to read. And of course, it all hinges on the statutory legislation on the 2 Acts of Parliament, one of which was written in 1847. So we have tried to pull everything together. But thank you very much indeed.
Just before I bring, oh, you've got something else? Sorry, Andrew. No, that's fine. Before I bring anything, okay, just to reiterate, just to colleagues and to the public watching home, this is just accumulating everything we've already got to that sense, and I think we all accept, particularly as we start discussing potential policy reviews and things like that, there's going to be a lot of tidying up. I think we all accept that really there should be probably a new Act of Parliament to tidy up a lot of this stuff, and there's no appetite that for any time soon. Councillor Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. And just in passing, I think Cllr Garthwaite is absolutely right about the language. But there are 2 reasons for this. First of all, it's wrong that a document should be published, which is ungrammatical. But secondly, and arguably more importantly, it can alter the meaning of what's been written and make it unclear, and therefore make it difficult in, let's say, a magistrate's court or a court of law of some description to apply the law properly. So I think it's a really important point. But on a similar theme, really, on page 37, the 2nd paragraph mentions that the vehicle must hold the full whole vehicle type European approval. Does that still apply, or is there some other standard now? Because we're not beholden to European standards now, are we? And I just wonder whether that's been transported across and whether it should say something slightly differently. And then finally, at the 2nd but final paragraph, well, the final paragraph of 6.4, it talks about the number of vehicles will fluctuate over time. And obviously, as we know, the number of vehicles has gone down, or it appears to have gone down. Certainly the number of drivers has gone down over the last year or so. And from personal experience, I've several times had a taxi booked well in advance, and it's all been confirmed. And then when it doesn't come and you ring up and say, where is it? They say, oh, well, there are no drivers available. And that's the end of the conversation. And I just wonder whether anything can be done about that, or whether it's just one of those things.
Just before I come down to just on the latter point, Councillor Buckley, I mean, as Andrew, I think, said that the council's job is not to regulate the market per se. Obviously, these are ongoing conversations, and myself and Councillor Cooper are having conversations with the trade on a variety of issues. I just want to make sure that we focus on the document, but I appreciate the question you've raised, but that's more of a market issue, which is not in the control of taxing private hire. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. I'd echo your comments, Councillor, in terms of the language. I don't know if we have accurately copied across poorly worded documents. Graham, you and I will sit down and make sure we go through every line to make sure we're absolutely clear. The intention is not to confuse, but the intention is exactly the opposite here, to make clear. However, the starting point for this is the wording in the original policy. And for example, there is a chapter in the policy on hackney carriage and private hire. The chapter in hackney carriage says we do limit the numbers, and for the private hire policy, it says we don't. And so we've provided one summary under 6.4 in terms of that. I think the key initial paragraph of that section is we want people to have enough access to the right sort of vehicle. In this section is on vehicles. We know that carriage and private hire vehicles are essential for transporting many people around Leeds, particularly in terms of the hackney carriage vehicles. At the moment, they provide something like 80% of all the wheelchair accessible vehicles in Leeds. Around that, and particularly the focus on the numbers for hackney carriages specifically in that point. And since lockdown, I've been getting, and I'm sure some members around the table today have been getting complaints from people saying, I specifically pre-booked a wheelchair accessible vehicle and that booking was not honoured. And see that as a very, very serious challenge to us. If that's about people not being able to be mobile, but also if you think about it, people not being able to get home after a visit, after a meeting and so on, that absolutely is, for me then it's not just an inconvenience, that's a safeguarding issue as well. So absolutely we need a supply of drivers, we need a supply of vehicles in order to meet the needs of the city. What I think the section on the vehicle numbers suggests is the council does not have the levers on the private hire side to stop the number of private hire vehicles that it licenses. As part of the sort of recovery plans from COVID and so on, we think we have got in excess of 250, maybe 300 people who've said they are interested in becoming drivers. We've got a further 600 drivers who are licensed by the council but currently not working. I suspect many of those will be doing delivery work and may return to private hire after Christmas, may not return in terms of that. So we know we need to rescope the provision the city needs following COVID. The provision in this policy isn't, none of the policies here were written with COVID in mind in terms of that, but absolutely in terms of the taxi and private hire, importance of having a taxi and private hire trade to the city, it's absolutely central in terms of that. In terms of the number, we know the numbers are down, potentially in terms of the journeys that are being requested and not honoured. That's in many cases, that's an issue for the private hire operator. If they've accepted a booking, what can they do to make sure that booking is honoured around that? Should they be subcontracting the booking between each other? Or do they say, sorry, can't honour it, and possibly some people would never use that private hire company again. So absolutely, it's a risk in terms of that. In terms of the provision in the policy here, as Chair says, this replicates the sections of the two particular separate areas for hackney carriage and private hire, and the very different provision we've got across the city for that in the numbers of vehicles.
Thank you.
Sorry, European all type approval. Until we hear otherwise, the UK policy will be to mirror whole vehicle type European approval, but that's taken from a policy document probably in 2013 or 14. Again, that preempts Brexit around that. But I'm very clear. I will ask the Department for Transport taxi unit and say, are you planning to review anything in line with this? Members may remember when we came to the statutory guidance, there's very little on vehicles, and particularly I was expecting more about Brexit and European approval. So at the moment, we might say attain the equivalent of whole vehicle type European approval, and that might be seen as an update in the policy that is not a major change, but it helps to clarify. And I think otherwise we might get unnecessary concerns.
Thank you for that. And again, the joy of at some points we need to do some new primary legislation in Parliament. Councillor Flynn.
Thanks, Paul. Just, I know we've covered it several times, but we are right in saying that not one word of taxi and private hire licensing policy has been changed. That's my first one. Second, have you advised the trade that all of these policies are going to be solidified into one policy? I know if there's been no changes, there's no need to consult, but have they actually been told what we're doing? Pages 13 and 14, there are two paragraph 27s, and I wonder whether there should be a paragraph 30 or number 30, not doing, sorry. And would it be helpful to have a suggested review date provided, as well as the date when the policies were implemented and when they were last reviewed?
Just on that point, Councillor Flynn, on the suggest review date, that was originally in the papers, and it was, and I asked for that, and Councillor Cabass to remove, just for the simple fact we don't want to create unrealistic expectations in trade. So take, for example, something like vehicle standards, that could take 3 months, that could take 9 months, depending on how complicated, how many subgroups, and also things can interchange. So just on that latter point, that was a political decision from Councillor Cooper and Councillor myself to ask the review date, as it were, to be taken out and it'd be moved into a priority list instead. So I just want to make sure that that's really clear. That was a decision from Councillor Cooper and Councillor myself, which we asked officers to take on board. If you want to pick up the rest, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Very, very briefly, we had the first of the new quarterly trade meetings, first and 2nd of December. So each of the meetings, we're still typing up the notes from the meetings. The meetings were very much anticipated, and therefore we've got quite a lot to type up. We absolutely discussed as part of the broader review of policies today's report. In terms of that, also I think in terms of that, we share a copy of the agenda for the meeting. Again, with the trade, it goes out ahead of the meeting. We have not asked trade representatives to give us a timetable. What we have done at the meetings is to ask them for their top priority or top 2 priorities, and they've been reflected in the section that we'll talk about in terms of the forward plan. What we haven't necessarily done is have the equivalent discussions with other stakeholder groups, so that would be road safety, older people's forum, and so on, as part of the work that we did around the consultation. We've got some new contacts now, and particularly there's people wanting to have a chat about older people friendly vehicles and so on. So we want to make sure that, I think, as part of that framework, that we're drawing in then people who are stakeholders as well as trade representatives. So yes, told the trade. No, nothing has been, and again, particularly Graham and I, it may well be that some of the clunky wording is something Graham has honestly transcribed from one policy document to another. I'm sure it's a case of copy and paste, and we will go through that. But no, the team have had a very, very clear steer from me, which is this is not the place for that fresh thinking. We can do it in another version, and we can mark it in red ink, as Cllr Garthwaite's done in terms of that. We will need to go back and check and double check. I think, Chair, I might have a discussion with you about the areas that might not be word for word what's in the previous policy, but like European type approval, to make very clear we could put a word in to say, look, or a footnote to say, this is actually what the policy means. There is no UK replacement for that, so we will say the equivalent of, and then to avoid that clarification. But no, this is very clear. This is not necessarily the policies or the summary of the policies that we would like to see. This is the policies as we currently find them, and then we will have an agenda going forward in terms of reviewing them one theme at a time, or as the Chair said, maybe even need to split up the themes into one or more sessions, depending on how easy it is to do that consultation and engagement.
And I think, just to stress, like I say, this is part of the journey of cleaning this up, and I say it was made quite clear from Councillor Cooper and myself that we did want this to go through the team and comms to make sure it's cleaned up. But it's I think we can all reflect that a lot of this stuff hasn't been reviewed for a very long time in terms of legislation. There's the complications of significant complications of case law, which has a huge impact on some of the primary legislation and the following regulations. So this is the beginning of a journey, not the end of it, as it were. I don't know if that's a pun or not, bearing in mind what we're doing today, but there you go. Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Chair. I can't see, it may already be in here, but I can't see anything in the appendices or in the document itself about the actual process of assessing the conditions of the vehicles. I just wondered if it would be useful to have that in for transparency and to ensure that there is consistency of the approach with regards to inspections of vehicles conditions.
I think the reason why we haven't got it in a policy document is we don't have a policy for inspection of vehicles. We've got a guidance document. It's a 55-page guidance document that includes summaries of how every single aspect of a vehicle will be inspected. The policy talks about the level that we need the vehicle to, and says it will be inspected to that standard. So then again, this is the difference between what's a policy and what's a more detailed process there. So the answer is we don't have a policy that's written in that way that says here is how we will inspect every vehicle, either when it's new or when it reaches an age extension, or when it's transferred, or when it's had an accident, and so on. The answer is the vehicle is inspected against our policy. So if there's a policy around manufacturer standard, or a policy around whether it's been adapted, or a policy around whether it's got tinted windows, and so on, the provision for that is in here. So each aspect of that is in the overall policy. How we do that, it just says we will do it. It's a bit like we don't say how we would process the driver. We would ask the questions, and then we would see if it met our standard. So it's certainly something where, let's go to the appendices at the back. So this is page 38, Councillor. So we've listed all the separate vehicle conditions, but not one of them says exactly how our officers would inspect a vehicle. but it does give the almost like the checklist against the things that the vehicle inspection would meet. So in my mind, there's 12 separate policies and conditions.
I think maybe just to pick up the point, Councillor Gibson, I think it is an interesting point. It's about at what level you have that transparency. So if this is an introductory document, which is also planned to go onto the council website and then linked to more complicated documents around the policy framework, that probably makes sense. There is probably a conversation that once that work's done about transparency of process, because I think it would be good for the trade to understand the procedural process. And I think sometimes in these committees, and particularly when we're speaking to the trade, we use the word policy interchangeably with a procedure, and they're not the same thing. And I think we perhaps need to be careful of our language, because actually, as we go through it in the conversations Councillor Cooper, myself and officers are having with the trade on a regular basis, there is the policy framework, which we'll be looking to review, which will obviously have a direct impact on the procedures that are used to implement that. But actually, there's stuff that's ongoing that actually is around process improvement and operational improvements, and that will be on a second tandem, and that will happen as we go through the other processes. But I think it's a fair point in a conversation to pick up that as we perhaps go through this journey of setting out the policy reviews, clarifying stuff, does then need to be a third kind of layer of information, so that actually, okay, I've looked at your policy, I know my vehicle needs to be inspected, can I just understand what you're looking for in a bit more detail? But I think it's kind of like a layer cake, and we're going through layer by layer to try and clarify stuff. If that sort of makes sense, I just think it's probably 2 steps beyond this one in terms of this is about the policy framework, there's the operational framework, and there's how we communicate that operational framework. Would you say that's a fair reflection, Andrew?
Yeah, I think particularly, I wonder if we might have a couple of pages on the what happens when your vehicle is inspected under the driver licensing guide to obtaining a license. And it might well be we can certainly check on what we've already listed here and see where it mentions an inspection to say that. I think particularly there are areas there, but I wouldn't regard it as an inspection policy protocol or whatever. We've got a very detailed sort of almost wheel by wheel checklist for our vehicle examiners, and we've got something similar for those on-street compliance checks, but it's not quite it's certainly not a policy in that respect, and therefore we haven't included. It's not an act of omission on our part. It's just not one of those areas that's a policy. I think it would be helpful to indicate that, so that people would know exactly what we do. The provision for us is probably in the letters that say your vehicle's about to come in, please remember to do X, Y, Z. It's not in a policy, but it's in our process. But very happy to do that, Chair.
I think it was a useful question, because actually it's about, and I think just going to the point, unlike other authorities, why we've wanted just to transcribe what's there, because actually we do know that the trade wants us to be open and transparent about how we're reviewing things and how we're demonstrating things. And I think from our perspective as a licensing authority, not changing things just because we had an opportunity to do so, but so that we can do that open and transparent process is what we should be about here, at least. And I think the comment, that next layer after we've done some of the policy reviews about operational transparency in terms of actually what is the procedure, where it's sensible to do so, is probably another more detailed conversation. We'll get to that when we get to it, because I want to get on to our Councillor Martin.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just briefly, and in the interests of transparency as well, the more detail on the right of appeal is needed, not in this document, but for the council generally. Would you agree?
It's the right of appeal is with the magistrates, and it's quite clear in legislation and case law. But again, I think it's one of these clarity things, and certainly as part of the policy reviews and the guidance from the Department of Transport, there is a review of decision making, which that will form part of, and again around clarity of how that is. And I think, yeah, we can make things clearer. The right's already there. Whether it's completely and utterly straightforward for someone to go A, B, C, D is another question, and that may change as we look at, or when we look at the policy review. But it's a fair point. But it already exists within the policy documents in terms of procedurally what happens. Whether we can make it clearer, I think, is a reasonable point. Any other questions or comments? Because I am rather interested in getting members' views on the indicative order of this, because this will form the bulk of our work probably for the next couple of years as a committee as we start going through this. So we've had feedback from the trade, we've had feedback from a lot of the complaints from the trade have sent, and the conversations Councillor Cooper, myself and officers have had, but I'm really keen to understand, looking at the indicative order of policy review, but also your opinions as to what we should or shouldn't be doing first, because as I've said, this will form the bulk of the work this committee in terms of taxi and private hire does probably for the next couple of years. So your views are as important as the trade's views. So I'll open that up to comment. Any views on what should be first or shouldn't be first?
Chair, if I can point your attention to where it is in the report.
Oh, yeah, it might be a good idea.
It's page 12 of your bundle, and it's also section 12 of the report. So following the trade meetings early in December, we've suggested a step-by-step approach. So we would look at the vehicles first, potentially, then operators, then decision-making, then drivers, then compliance and enforcement, then governing and sharing information. There's a very strong preference from maybe 2/3 of the trade meetings for vehicles to be considered first.
Thank you for that. That was a helpful clarification of where it was. There's just, I've read this a few too many times myself. So do members have any views on bearing in mind actually some of these are pretty meaty, so it might only be one heading, but actually vehicle standards might be at least a good 6 months plus amount of work, to put it politely, and probably longer depending on the amount of changes we potentially may or may not suggest, and the level of consultation and the interaction with our neighbouring authorities, etc. we would have to have. From your conversations with the trade, I know many of you have had emails and other conversations, from your feeling of your constituents, both in the trade and actually members of the public and other stakeholders, do you feel we've got the indicative order right? Do you feel it should be reordered? What are your views? Councillor
So I've just realised number 3 is missing. There isn't a number 3 that has been deleted. I mean, I think I'd absolutely agree with you, Kat. I think for me, the question was, there's a big overlap between compliance and enforcement and gathering and sharing information. And I think, I'm not saying we could do them both at the same time, but there's certainly an element of what questions are we asking, who do we need to talk to, where are the new lines of investigation or inquiry. That absolutely makes sense to me, Councillor.
Any other comments or questions on this? Because as I said, this is going to, particularly if some of you are maybe on this committee for the next few years, this is going to be form the bulk of the work we do on taxi and private hire in terms of reviewing these policies. So any other questions or comments beyond Councillor Lennox's? Very unusually silent. Am I to take it then from members that they are broadly supportive? Bear in mind that this is potentially changeable if there's a particular piece of case law that might mean we have to completely rejig things, or new guidance from the government, etc. This is a bit of a movable feast. But am I taking it from members that they are relatively comfortable with the indicative order of doing this? Bear in mind, much of this has been based on what the trade has said to us. So we have tried to reflect not all of the trade. Some of the trade want other things to be dealt with first, but we have to start somewhere. But I'm getting some nods, and that we're relatively comfortable with this as the general direction. Okay, so I have to do the formal bit about the recommendations now, don't I? Can I ask the members to endorse the taxi and private hire policy? The single document comprises a summary of existing policy conditions and conditions indicated in the appendix, We are also asked to approve the indicative review timetable, or more probably accurately order. Can I have a show of hands for those? All in favour? And just for clarity, any against? Any abstentions? We've accepted that recommendation. Do members have, sorry, item agenda number 9, which is sort of going to be based on this to a certain extent. Do members have any questions with respect to the work programme at the back of your pack? Councillor Flynn?
Not a question, Paul, just that to ensure we get the documentation for the next meeting, that suitability policy well in advance of the meeting with a, I mean, there've been hundreds of responses, I understand, Andrew, to the to this review.
You're referring to the minor motoring conviction suitability criteria, I believe.
Yes, we've had over 2,000 responses. We think there's some duplication in there, so it's a little bit tricky to go through that. I think we got chair's brief on about the 12th of January, Chair. So we'll be
so.
Yeah, well ahead of the schedule for licensing committee, Councillor.
Any other comments or questions on the work programme? No, that sounds good. So item agenda number 10, date and time of the next meeting. To note that the next meeting will take place on Tuesday, the 20th of January, 2022 at 10 AM at Leeds Civic Hall, unless the government decides to change any legislation in the meantime. That concludes the business of today's meeting. Thank you for your attendance and contributions. I now declare the meeting closed.